Chapter 1, Meetings in the Shadows. The year was 1972, and Chicago was a city pulsing with life, but beneath the surface, it simmered with darkness. Winds off Lake Michigan carried the smell of industry and corruption, while the neon lights on Michigan Avenue cast long shadows over those moving in the business of the night. In the heart of the city, in an old warehouse by the river, Tony, the Bull Rossi, head of Chicago's Italian mafia family, sat staring across a table littered with cigar stubs and empty whiskey glasses. His face was a web of scars, memories of years fighting rivals and cops who'd gotten too close. Tony wasn't alone. Across from him sat a man who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a Soviet propaganda poster, broad-shouldered, with cold blue eyes and an accent sharp as a knife. He called himself Viktor Kuznetsov, but Tony knew it was an alias. Viktor represented the Russian mafia, the Bratva, who had slipped into America through Canada after fleeing Stalin's shadows. The two men had met through a mutual contact in New York, an Armenian smuggler who promised that this deal would make them richer than they'd ever dreamed. "The deal is simple," Viktor said in his hard, rolling Russian accent. "We deliver weapons from the Soviet Union, AK-47s, grenades, even some experimental explosives the KGB doesn't know we stole. You pay with your diamonds from Africa and your narcotics from Colombia. We split the profits 50-50. Tony leaned back in his chair, lit a fresh cigar, and exhaled the smoke slowly. He wasn't a rookie. The Chicago mob had built its empire on bootleg liquor during Prohibition. Now it was drugs, weapons, and influence, but doing business with the Russians was dangerous. The Soviet Union was in the grip of the Cold War, and the KGB had eyes everywhere. Interpol, too, had started sniffing around after reports of increased arms trafficking across the Atlantic. "I don't trust you Russians," Tony muttered. "You've got your own agendas." "What happens if your KGB pals show up and take everything?" Viktor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the warehouse. "The KGB, they're hunting dogs, but we're wolves. They think they control us, but we have Nashi Ludi, our people on the inside. The deal goes through, or else." He dragged a finger across his throat, a gesture leaving no room for doubt. Outside the warehouse, in a parked car across the street, sat KGB agent Ivan Petrov. A Stalingrad veteran with a face that had seen too many corpses, Petrov had orders to stop the deal at any cost, even if it meant killing everyone involved. Next to him sat Marie Dupont, an Interpol agent from France, sharp-eyed with a memory for details and a gift for reading people. "They're inside," she whispered. "We've planted microphones. If we hit now, we can take them all." Petrov shook his head. "No, we wait. We need evidence, the whole chain. Let them dig their own grave." Inside the warehouse, negotiations continued. Tony called in his men, Frankie, the Knife, Lombardi and Joey, Two-Face, Marino, both loyal soldiers with blood on their hands from countless gang wars. Viktor had brought his own muscle. Sergei, a tattooed giant whose ink told gulag stories, and Olga, a woman who looked like a model but carried a pistol under her skirt. The plan was laid out. Delivery at the Chicago docks aboard a Panamanian-flagged ship. Weapons hidden in crates marked humanitarian aid, a dark joke that made them all laugh. Payment would be in cash and diamonds worth millions. But then came a knock at the door. Silence. Frankie drew his gun and crept forward. Outside stood a street kid Tony knew. "Boss, cops outside, they've surrounded the place." Panic erupted. Viktor cursed in Russian. Sergei reached for his gun. Tony thought fast. These weren't regular cops. It smelled federal, maybe even international. "We've got to get out," he said. "But how?" Then inspiration struck. The warehouse was stacked with stolen UN peacekeeper uniforms meant for sale on the black market. "Suit up," Tony barked. "We're UN soldiers now. They won't dare shoot us." Within minutes, the mobsters and Russians donned blue helmets and fake ids, hiding weapons beneath the gear. They marched out the back door like a patrol on duty. Outside, Petrov and Dupont hesitated. "What the hell?" Petrov muttered. "UN here." Before they could react, the peacekeepers opened fire. Chaos. Frankie gunned down an Interpol agent. Sergei gutted a KGB man with a knife. Petrov returned fire, hitting Joey in the leg. Joey shot back, wounding Petrov in the shoulder. Blood painted the snow, winter in Chicago, bitter and cold. Olga slit another agent's throat without a flinch. Tony led the escape toward the docks. A getaway car waited. Victor ran over an Interpol agent with a stolen truck. Joey bled out in the backseat, cursing the KGB with his last breath. The mob and Bratva fled aboard their ship, weapons and diamonds intact. Petrov swore revenge. "They won't get away," he snarled as DuPont bandaged his shoulder. "We'll hunt them to the ends of the earth." As their ship slipped into Lake Michigan's darkness, Tony stared ahead. This was only the beginning. The Russians had contacts, the Chicago mob had resources, but the KGB was ruthless, and Interpol would never stop. The bloodshed had only begun. Chapter 2, Blood on the Waves. The ship Stella Maris cut through the dark waters of Lake Michigan, its hull creaking under the weight of its illegal cargo. It was a cold February night in 1972, and a heavy fog hung over the lake, as if nature itself conspired to hide Tony, the bull, Rossi, and his unlikely allies from the Bratva. In the cargo hold were crates marked humanitarian aid, a lie concealing AK-47s, grenades, and enough explosives to blow up a small town. The diamonds and cash payment for the deal were hidden in a secret compartment beneath the captain's cabin. Tony stood at the rail, a cigar glowing between his fingers, staring into the fog. He could still hear the echo of gunfire from the warehouse, still smell the blood that clung to the air. Viktor Kuznetsov stood beside him with a bottle of vodka in hand. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes held a sharp, watchful gleam. "We made it, Rossi," he said, voice low and cutting, but it was too close. "Your streets aren't as safe as you claim," Tony snorted. "Safe? Chicago's a jungle, Kuznetsov, but it's my jungle. If it weren't for your Russian friends leaking to the KGB, we wouldn't have had this mess." Victor took a swig of vodka, eyeing Tony with suspicion. "The KGB isn't my fault. They're like fleas, everywhere, always biting, but we have a plan. Next stop is New Orleans. There we meet my contacts from Havana. They'll take the weapons south to the revolutionaries in Latin America. The money flows in, and we get richer." Tony nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't trust Victor. The Bratva were famous for double crosses, and Tony had heard stories about allies left to die when it suited them. But the deal was too big to walk away from. Millions were at stake, enough to tighten his grip on Chicago, maybe even take New York from the five families. In the engine room, Frankie, the knife, Lombardi and Sergei, the Bratva's hulking enforcer, stood guard over the cargo. Frankie was in a foul mood. The loss of Joey, Two-Face, Marino at the warehouse still burned in his chest. Joey had been his friend since they were kids on the streets of Little Italy. "Damn it, Sergei," Frankie muttered, wiping blood from his knife. "We lost a good man. If your people didn't have so many enemies, Joey would still be breathing." Sergei shrugged, his tattoos glinting under the dim glow of a bare bulb. "War has losses, Italian, you're too soft. In the Gulag I learned, survive or die. Joey died. You live, be grateful." Frankie spat on the floor. "Grateful? I'll show you grateful when I gut you like a pig." Before Sergei could answer, a thud echoed from the deck, above the sound of something heavy landing on the ship. Both men grabbed their weapons and sprinted up the stairs. On deck stood Olga, Victor's deadly right hand, a submachine gun gripped tight. Her eyes locked on a small boat cutting through the fog. "We've got company," she said coldly. "Not ours." Tony and Victor drew their pistols, crouching behind a container. Through the mist, they saw dark silhouettes, men in black uniforms, moving silent and precise. "KGB," Victor hissed. "They must have tracked us from the docks." But it wasn't just the KGB. In the shadows was Marie DuPont of Interpol, who had chartered a U.S. Coast Guard boat to follow Stella Maris. She'd sworn not to let these criminals slip away again. Her team was small but elite, ex-French legionnaires and American FBI agents, all armed to the teeth. Petrov, the KGB agent, was with her, his shoulder bandaged but his will unbroken. He had a personal reason now, revenge for his fallen men. "We hit them now," Petrov growled, chambering around. No mercy. The battle erupted like an explosion. KGB agents hurled grappling hooks and swarmed aboard, while Interpol's team opened fire from their boat. Bullets screamed through the air, and the fog turned crimson with blood. Frankie stabbed a KGB man in the gut, his face sprayed red as he roared like an animal. Sergei lobbed a grenade at the attacking boat, the blast hurling 2 Interpol agents into the water, their screams swallowed by the waves. Tony and Victor fought side by side, though the tension between them was palpable. When a KGB agent took aim at Tony, Victor hesitated a second too long before shooting. Tony noticed. "Trying to let me die, Russian?" he shouted over the gunfire. Victor smirked. "If I wanted you dead, Rossi, you already would be." Olga was a whirlwind of death. She moved like a shadow, her blades flashing in the moonlight. An Interpol agent tried to grab her. She broke his arm in one swift move and drove a knife into his heart. "Too weak," she muttered as he dropped, but the tide turned. Petrov, ruthless as ever, tossed a smoke grenade that blanketed the deck in choking grey. His men, trained for such chaos, wore gas masks and advanced methodically. One of Tony's soldiers, a young kid named Mikey, took a bullet to the head and crumpled lifeless to the deck. Blood trickled between the planks, mingling with lake water. "We've got to get out of here," Tony shouted. He had a plan, insane, desperate, but their only shot. In the hold was an inflatable life raft hidden for emergencies. If they could reach it and dump some cargo as a distraction, they might vanish into the fog. Victor hesitated. "The cargo's worth millions. We can't just. We live to fight another day," Tony roared. "Or do you want to die here?" Reluctantly, Victor agreed. They sprinted to the hold, while Olga and Sergei laid down covering fire. Crates of weapons splashed into the lake, a show to make it look like they were destroying evidence. In truth, the diamonds were stashed in the raft. As they paddled into the mist, they heard Petrov bellow in rage. He'd realized they'd slipped away again. Marie Dupont stood beside him, her face hard. "They can't hide forever," she said. "We'll find them in New Orleans." In the life raft, Tony and Victor sat in silence, clothes soaked with blood and lake water. Olga wiped her blade clean while Sergei stared into the darkness. They'd survived, but at a price. Mikey was dead, and most of the cargo was gone, but the diamonds were safe, and the deal could still be saved. "New Orleans," Tony said at last. "We start over there. But Victor, if you try to double-cross me again, I'll cut your heart out myself." Victor smiled thinly, his eyes cold. "We are partners, Rossi, for now." In the distance, the wail of Coast Guard sirens echoed faintly, but the fog shielded them. They were heading for the next chapter of their bloody empire, and the hunt was far from over. Chapter 3, Secrets of the Swamp, New Orleans, March 1972. The city was a melting pot of jazz, sweat, and secrets, where Mardi Gras masks hid both faces and intentions. The air was thick with humidity from the Mississippi River, and the scent of spicy jambalaya mingled with the faint stench of gunpowder and corruption. Tony, the bull Rossi, and his decimated crew had arrived in the city after a grueling journey from Chicago, hidden aboard a fishing boat that smuggled them south along the coast. The diamonds, their last chance to salvage the deal with the Bratva, rested safely in a steel chest under Tony's watchful eye. But distrust between the Chicago mob and the Russian Bratva grew like a poisonous vine, ready to strangle them all. They had holed up in a crumbling mansion on Bayou St. John, owned by Victor's contact, Carlos El Cuervo Rivera, a Cuban exile with connections across Latin America. The mansion was a ruin, moss hung from the oaks, walls peeled with rot, and windows were filmed with grime, but it was perfect for their needs. Secluded, hard to find, and easy to defend. Carlos was a thin man with sharp eyes and a perpetual cigar clenched between his teeth. He'd built a smuggling network from Havana to Bogotá, and his role was to connect them with buyers for the weapons, revolutionaries in Nicaragua willing to pay in gold and cocaine. Tony stood in the mansion's living room, surrounded by cracked mirrors and a dusty crystal chandelier that creaked in the wind. He glared at Viktor Kuznetsov, who lounged in a torn leather armchair with a bottle of vodka in his hand. "You said this place was safe," Tony growled, "but I don't trust your Cuban. He looks like a snake, and I'm sick of betrayal." Victor took a swig and shrugged, his cold blue eyes unmoved. Carlos is loyal to whoever pays best. Right now, that's us. Relax, Rossi. We have the diamonds, and soon we'll have new buyers. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua will pay anything for weapons. Frankie, the knife, Lombardi, still mourning the death of Joey, Two-Face, Marino, stood at the window keeping watch, his knife glinting in the light of a flickering lamp. I don't like this, boss, he muttered. Feels like a setup, too many eyes in this town. Seege, the Bratva's tattooed giant, snorted from across the room. You Italians always complain. This is the swamp. No one finds us here. Olga, Victor's deadly right hand, sat at a table cleaning her submachine gun. She cast a cold glance at Frankie. If you're so scared, Lombardi, stay in Chicago next time. We need men, not boys. The tension broke when Carlos entered with a map of the Mississippi River. The deal is set, he said in his soft but firm Cuban accent. The ship arrives tomorrow night. The buyers, the Sandinistas, will meet us at an abandoned dock in Barataria Bay. They pay in gold and cocaine, but we must be careful. The swamp is crawling with federal agents. Tony nodded, but his gut screamed that something was wrong. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and now it felt like even the walls were listening. He shot Victor a glance. The Russian seemed far too calm. Was it confidence or treachery? Across town, in a dingy motel room near the French Quarter, KGB agent Ivan Petrov and Interpol agent Marie Dupont reviewed their plans. Petrov was still marked by the battle on Lake Michigan, his shoulder stiff from a bullet wound, but his will was iron. He had called in reinforcements from Moscow, a team of ruthless operatives who never hesitated to kill. Petrov wasn't just after stopping the deal. He wanted to crush the Bratva and send a message to anyone daring to defy the Soviet Union. His methods were brutal. Once he had tortured a suspected spy for 3 days before dumping the body in the Volga River. Marie Dupont, on the other hand, was driven by justice. She had seen too much corruption in her years at Interpol, and the thought of weapons flooding into Latin America's war zones made her furious. But she disliked Petrov's methods. We take them alive, she said sharply, tapping a map of the swamp. We need evidence to bring down the entire network, not just bodies. Petrov smirked, his scarred face like a mask. Alive. Maybe, but if they resist, I'll cut them to pieces myself. Back at the mansion, preparations for the deal began. Carlos explained that the ship, La Libertad, would arrive under the cover of darkness. The weapons, or what remained of them after Lake Michigan, would be transferred to the Sandinistas' boats, while gold and cocaine would be exchanged for the diamonds. But Tony was worried. They had lost much of the cargo in Chicago, and he suspected Victor was hiding something. Did the Bratva have its own plan? Would they try to take the diamonds and leave the Chicago mob to die? The night of the deal was moonless, and the swamp was a maze of black water and cypress trees. The group moved silently in small boats, guided by Carlo's knowledge of the bayou. Tony kept the chest of diamonds close, pistol in hand. Frankie and Seege guarded the flanks, while Olga led the way, her eyes like a panther's in the dark. At the dock, the Sandinistas awaited, hard men scarred from guerrilla warfare, led by a man called Comandante Diego. Short, muscular, with a gaze that could freeze blood. Where are the weapons? He asked, his voice low and threatening. Victor nodded toward the crates in the boats. Everything's here. Show us the gold. Diego gestured, and his men produced bags filled with gold bars and bricks of pure cocaine. But before the deal could close, a sound cut through the night, a low hum of an approaching boat engine. Everyone froze. Feds, Carlos whispered. It was a trap. Petrov and Dupont had tracked them through an informant in Carlos' network. KGB and Interpol had joined forces with local FBI agents, now closing in from two sides, their boats slicing through the swamp. Searchlights swept across the water and loudspeakers blared. Drop your weapons, you're surrounded. Chaos erupted. Diego and his men opened fire, convinced Tony and Victor had betrayed them. Frankie dove behind a cypress and shot back, hitting a Sandinista in the chest, blood spraying into the dark water where alligators circled hungrily. Seege hurled a grenade that blew apart an Interpol boat, sending shrapnel and bodies flying. Olga moved like a shadow, her knives cutting down 2 FBI agents before they could react. Petrov was relentless. Despite his injured shoulder, he leapt into the water and swam to Tony's boat, a knife between his teeth. Climbing aboard, he slashed at Tony, who barely dodged. "You die tonight, Italian," Petrov roared. Tony answered with a gunshot, but Petrov rolled aside and vanished into the darkness. In the middle of the chaos, Victor did the unthinkable. He seized the chest of diamonds and leapt onto one of the Sandinistas' boats. "We are done here, Rossi," he shouted. "Good luck." Before Tony could react, Victor vanished with Diego and the gold, leaving the Chicago mob to face the enemy alone. Tony cursed, his rage volcanic, but there was no time to chase Victor. He, Frankie, and Olga fought their way through the swamp, blood and mud soaking their clothes. They stole one of Interpol's boats and escaped as Petrov and DuPont shouted orders into the night. They found refuge in an abandoned fishing shack, battered and empty-handed. The diamonds were gone, Victor had betrayed them, and their enemies were closer than ever. Tony clenched his fist. "This ain't over," he growled. "We'll hunt that bastard to the ends of the earth." Chapter 4, The Price of Betrayal. The swamps of Barataria Bay were behind them, but blood and betrayal still hung heavy in the air. Tony, the bull, Rossi, Frankie, the knife, Lombardi, and Olga, the Bratva's deadly femme fatale, had barely escaped death in New Orleans. They had fled to an abandoned fishing shack deep in the marsh, a damp hole where the walls smelled of rotting wood and the floor was caked with mud. The diamonds were gone, stolen by Viktor Kuznetsov, who had betrayed them to secure his own future with the Sandinistas. Tony sat on a rickety chair, his face a mask of rage and exhaustion as he cleaned his pistol with a filthy rag. The blood from the fight had dried on his hands, and every breath reminded him how close they had come to losing everything. Frankie stood by the door, knife in hand, staring into the darkness. "We should have seen it coming, boss," he muttered. "You can't trust Russians. Victor planned this from the start." Olga, sitting on the floor bandaging a wound on her leg, shot him a sharp look. "Shut your mouth, Italian," she snapped. "Victor's a snake, but I'm Bratva, I'm loyal. He'll pay for this, but not because you whine about it." Tony slammed his fist on the table so hard that an empty whiskey bottle toppled over. "Enough squabbling," he roared. "This isn't over. Victor thinks he can take our diamonds and disappear, but he forgets. The Chicago mob never forgets betrayal. We'll hunt him down, and when we find him, I'll carve his heart out myself." But the reality was grim. They were stranded in Louisiana, broke, unarmed, and with both the KGB and Interpol on their trail. Ivan Petrov, the ruthless KGB agent, had sworn to crush them, and his methods were brutal. He had already shown his merciless streak in the swamp, shooting one of his own men without blinking when he hesitated to follow orders. Marie DuPont from Interpol wasn't much better. Her obsession with justice made her unpredictable, and she had the resources of the local FBI office at her disposal. Time was short, and Tony knew they needed a new plan, and fast. A new alliance dawn broke over the swamp, and an unexpected visitor appeared. Carlos El Cuervo Rivera, the Cuban who had arranged the New Orleans deal, knocked on the shack door. His cigar was lit, as always, and his grin was as untrustworthy as a crocodile's. "Rossi," he said, glancing at the group, "you look like hell, but I've got a proposal." Tony stood up, pistol already in hand. "Give me one reason not to shoot you, Carlos. Your deal cost us everything." Carlos raised his hands, his voice calm. "Listen before you shoot. Victor betrayed me too. He took the gold and cocaine meant for me. I want revenge, just like you. I know where he's headed, Miami. He's planning to sell the diamonds to a Colombian cartel and use the money to build his own empire." Tony exchanged a glance with Frankie and Olga. He didn't trust Carlos, but the information was too valuable to ignore. "What do you want?" Tony asked. "A cut," Carlos replied. "I've got contacts in Miami, smugglers, crooked cops, even a man inside the cartel. Help me take back what's mine, and you get your diamonds. Plus, I can get you out of this swamp." Olga stood, her eyes narrowing. "And why should we trust you? You led us straight into a trap." Carlos laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "The trap wasn't mine. One of Victor's men sold us out to the KGB. I lost 3 of my best guys in that swamp. I'm just as pissed as you are." Tony thought fast. They had no choice. Without resources, they were dead in the swamp. "All right, Cuervo," Tony said, "but if you double-cross us, you're gator bait." The hunt begins. Carlos smuggled them out of the swamp in an airboat, gliding silently through the dark waters. They reached the New Orleans docks, where he had an old Cadillac stashed in a garage. They drove south toward Miami, the road trip thick with tension and paranoia. Every passing car could have been KGB or Interpol. Frankie kept his knife ready, Olga rested a submachine gun across her lap, and Tony stared out the window, his mind on Victor and how he'd crush him. In Miami, they met Carlos's contact, a crooked cop named Detective Alvarez, who took bribes from both the mob and the cartels. Alvarez was a short, sweaty man with a mustache that belonged in a bad movie. "Victor's on a yacht off the coast," Alvarez said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "He's meeting the Colombians tomorrow night, but you gotta move fast. Petrov's already in town, and he's got men everywhere." Tony's pulse quickened. Petrov was like a bloodhound, and his ruthlessness made him deadly. Tony remembered how the KGB agent had slit his own man's throat in the swamp to keep discipline. But Tony didn't have time to worry. He had a plan, a risky one. The trap in Miami, the night of the meeting, was sticky and hot, with the moon casting silver light across the Atlantic. Tony, Frankie, Olga, and Carlos approached the yacht in a stolen speedboat, dressed in black to melt into the darkness. Alvarez had given them blueprints of the yacht, Estrella del Sur, and they knew Victor would be in the salon with the Colombians. But when they climbed aboard, chaos greeted them. Gunfire cracked across the deck, and bodies already littered the floor. Victor hadn't just betrayed Tony, he'd tried to cheat the Colombians too. The cartel had struck back, and the yacht was a war zone. Tony spotted Victor running toward a lifeboat, diamonds in a bag slung over his shoulder. "Now," Tony shouted. They charged into the fight. Frankie cut down a cartel gunman, blood spraying across the deck. Olga fired with deadly precision, dropping 2 men before they could draw. Carlos, surprisingly fast, hurled a knife that buried itself in another man's neck. But Petrov was there. Emerging from the shadows, his rifle spat fire. A bullet tore into Carlos's leg, dropping him screaming. Tony dove behind a lifeboat and returned fire, but Petrov was like a demon, unshaken by the chaos, driven by pure vengeance. "Rossi," he bellowed, "your head is mine." In the melee, Olga reached Victor at the lifeboat. She raised her pistol but hesitated. "Why, Victor?" she demanded, her voice laced with betrayal. Victor smiled coldly. "Because I'm Bratva, Olga. And Bratva takes what it wants." Before she could fire, Victor hurled a smoke grenade and vanished into the water. Olga cursed in Russian as Tony and Frankie fought their way to her. They had lost the diamonds again, and Carlos was badly wounded. Worse, Petrov had seen them, and his men were closing fast. They escaped in the speedboat, bullets whining past them. Miami receded behind them, but the hunt wasn't over. Victor was still free, and Petrov was closer than ever. Tony clenched his fist. "We don't stop until he's dead," he swore. Chapter 5. The last dance. Miami was behind them, but its heat and chaos clung to Tony, the bull, Rossi, Frankie, the knife, Lombardi, and Olga like a shadow. They had fled the yacht Estrella del Sur in a stolen speedboat, with Carlos El Cuervo Rivera gravely wounded, bleeding out in the bottom of the boat. Victor Kuznetsov, traitor to the Bratva, had slipped through their fingers once again, diamonds in hand, and a mocking smile burned into Tony's memory. The waves pounded the hull as they steered toward a small island in the Florida Keys, a place Carlos had once mentioned as a last resort. But Tony knew they couldn't hide for long. Ivan Petrov of the KGB and Marie Dupont of Interpol were on their heels, and together they were a lethal combination. The island was little more than a barren scrap of sand and palms, crowned by an abandoned lighthouse rising into the starlit sky. April 1972 was hotter than usual, the air thick with salt and desperation. Tony carried Carlos to the lighthouse, laying him on a filthy mattress. His leg was mangled, Petrov's bullet had shattered his knee, and the blood loss left him pale as death. Olga, silent since the showdown with Victor, sat beside him and cleaned the wound with a bottle of rum from Carlos' bag. "We can't stay here," Frankie muttered, scanning the shoreline through the lighthouse's cracked windows. "Petrov will find us. He's like a damn bloodhound." Tony nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Victor hadn't just stolen the diamonds. He'd shattered their plans, betrayed both the Bratva and the Chicago mob, and left them to die. But something about it gnawed at Tony. Why had Victor hesitated to kill Olga, and what had he meant when he said the Bratva takes what it wants? It felt like there was a bigger game being played, something beyond diamonds and weapons. Carlos coughed weakly and grabbed Tony's arm. "Rossi, listen," he whispered. "Victor isn't alone. He's working for someone higher up. The Bratva has contacts in Moscow, maybe even in Washington. The diamonds are just part of it. They're planning something big." Tony clenched his eyes shut. "What do you mean? What are they planning?" Carlos tried to answer, but his voice faded and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Olga swore in Russian and hurled the rum bottle against the wall, shattering it to pieces. "He's lying," she shouted. "Victor is a traitor, but the Bratva is my family. They wouldn't betray me." Frankie turned, knife already in hand. "Your family. They left you to die in the swamp, Olga, wake up." Before she could respond, a low hum of an engine echoed outside. Tony ran to the window and saw searchlights cutting through the darkness. "They're here," he muttered. "Petrov and DuPont. We are out of options." The final battle, the lighthouse, became their last fortress. Tony, Frankie, and Olga barricaded the door with old crates and rusted scrap metal. Carlos was too weak to fight, but he gave them one last gift: a hidden stash of grenades and a Thompson submachine gun tucked beneath the floorboards. "For emergencies," he'd said with a faint smile before blacking out again. Petrov landed first, his KGB team moving like shadows in the night, 6 men, armed with automatic weapons, trained in Soviet warfare. Marie DuPont arrived moments later with a smaller FBI contingent, but her presence complicated things. She wanted them alive, while Petrov had no such scruples. "Rossi," Petrov roared from the beach, his voice echoing over the waves. "Come out, or we burn this island to the ground." Tony glanced at Olga. "Any last words for your old friend?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. Olga spat on the floor. "He's dead to me." The fight began with an explosion. Petrov lobbed a smoke grenade through the window, choking the lighthouse with fumes. Frankie opened fire blindly through the haze, cutting down a KGB agent in a spray of blood. Olga hurled a grenade back, the blast tearing 2 more of Petrov's men to pieces. Petrov was relentless. He scaled the lighthouse wall like a spider, knife clenched between his teeth. When he reached the window, Tony was waiting with a rusted iron bar. They fought like animals, blood and sweat mixing as they traded blows. Petrov was stronger, but Tony was faster. With a vicious swing, Tony knocked the knife from Petrov's grip and kicked him square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground below. Outside, DuPont struggled to maintain control. "Cease fire," she shouted at Petrov's men. "We need them alive," but no one listened. An FBI agent took a bullet to the head, crimson spraying across the sand. Then something unexpected. A new boat appeared on the horizon, and out stepped Viktor Kuznetsov, flanked by Colombian cartel gunmen. He hadn't run to safety, he'd brought reinforcements. "Rossi," Viktor called, "let's finish this." Tony realized Viktor wasn't just a traitor, he was a player, pulling every string for his own gain, but there was no time to think. Olga, blinded by rage, burst out of the lighthouse and opened fire on Viktor. Her bullets dropped a Colombian, but Viktor ducked and returned fire, hitting her in the shoulder. She collapsed, screaming in pain. Frankie rushed to shield her, but a grenade blast hurled him back, bloody and unconscious. Tony was alone now, surrounded by enemies, but he wasn't finished. Grabbing the Thompson, he unleashed a hail of bullets, mowing down 2 cartel soldiers and catching Petrov in the leg as he tried to charge again. Amid the chaos, Tony saw his chance. He yanked out one last grenade and hurled it at Viktor's boat. The explosion ignited the fuel tank, turning the vessel into a fireball. Viktor's scream echoed as the flames swallowed him, his silhouette vanishing into the inferno. The diamonds, locked in a bag aboard the boat, sank into the black water. Petrov and DuPont retreated, their forces shattered. Tony carried Olga and Frankie back inside the lighthouse, where Carlos miraculously still breathed. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. The diamonds were gone, Victor was dead, and their enemies would never stop hunting them. An open road by morning, Tony sat on the beach staring out at the sea. Olga, shoulder-bandaged, lowered herself beside him. "What now?" she asked, her voice tired but resolute. "We rebuild," Tony said. "Chicago's still ours. We'll find new deals, new allies, but first we rest." Far off, sirens wailed faintly. Petrov and DuPont would return, but not today. Carlo's warning about a greater conspiracy echoed in Tony's mind. If the Bratva had contacts in both Moscow and Washington, this was only the beginning. Epilogue: the first rays of the sun pierced through the morning mist over the Florida Keys, and the waves lapped gently against the shore. Tony sat by the water, his body tired but his mind sharp. Before him lay what remained of his world, the friends who still stood by his side, the scars that told stories of battles fought, and a distant city waiting for his return. The world was still full of dangers. The Bratva had more secrets than anyone could count, and international agents lurked in the shadows. But for the first time in a long while, there was a spark of control, of possibility. Tony knew he had survived hell on earth, and this was only the beginning. In a world where loyalty was bought and betrayal was currency, he remained, not as a victim, not as a pawn under someone else's plans, but as a man who would keep hunting, keep striking back, and keep carving his name into the dark shadows only he could rule.